Welcome to How to Change a Tire by Mr.Fleugel. First of all, what is a spare tire and why would we need to change it? So most cars come with a spare tire. It's in case of an emergency. They're usually tucked in the back trunk in case one of the four main tires you have on your car gets a pop, gets a puncture, or loses air over time. All right, so when we need to change the spare tire for our vehicle, we're gonna head to the rear of the vehicle. I already popped the trunk for us. And we're gonna look in the rear of the vehicle, and underneath the floor mat is gonna be where the spare tire is, where our jack is, and where all the tire changing tools are gonna be. So we're gonna remove these from the trunk, pop them out, and then we'll go from there. Once we remove the tools, we're gonna spin this nut off, and then we can take the tire from the trunk and bring it out. So here are our tools to change the tires. We have our jack, we have our tool here to raise and lower the jack, and then we have the lug nut wrench. An important thing to note with spare tires is they're a lot smaller and more narrow than the stock tires that are going to be on your vehicle. So on the side of almost all spare tires, you'll see a 50 and an 80 on the sidewall. So that means when you're driving with the spare tire on, you can't go faster than 50 miles an hour. That's about 80 kilometers. And you must not drive for more than 80 miles. So that's about 110 kilometers. This is just because the rubber on the spare tire, there's a lot less of it. So you don't want to burn through the rubber. These tires are just meant to get you to the nearest tire shop, not to drive around town on. Safety. We want to ensure our vehicle's on flat ground before we lift it. We want to put a wheel chock under one of the tires that we are not removing. We want to pull the car's e-brake before we lift it up. And we want to check the car's jack points before we get started. These will usually be in the owner's manual or they'll be online if they're not in the manual. And now just a brief overview of the procedure that we're going to follow while we change these spare tires. Once the car's on flat ground, we want to crack all of the lug nuts before we raise it off the ground. We want to do this just because the lug nuts are going to be tightened pretty tight and we won't be able to effectively loosen them while the wheel is in the air and spinning. We want to double check the lift points. We're going to seat the jack underneath the appropriate lift point on the car, and we want to make sure as the jack lifts up that it's seated really nicely on that lift point. Once we jack up the car, we're going to remove the lug nuts with our lug wrench, and we want to put the lug nuts down in a nice safe spot where we won't lose any of them. So once all the lug nuts are off, we can remove the flat tire and we'll place that to the side, and then we're going to replace it with the spare tire. So we're going to hand tighten the lug nuts at the beginning. We just want to do that to make sure that they don't cross thread, and when we tighten them, they lock in there. As we're tightening the lug nuts, we want to do that in a star pattern, just so that the wheel evenly seats on the rim there. And then once those are all tightened, we're going to slowly lower the vehicle back down to the ground. And once the wheel is on the ground, we're going to ensure that all 5 of the lug nuts are going to be tightened properly. In this picture, I'm identifying the appropriate lift points for my car, a 2011 Volkswagen Jetta. There is a green highlight on the area that you want to jack the car from, and then there's red highlights on the area where you do not want to jack the car from. Now that the wheels are chalked and everything else is set up, the e-brake is pulled, we're going to crack the lug nuts while the vehicle's still on the ground. We're going to place the jack under the vehicle, make sure it's under the appropriate lift point, and then we're going to jack the vehicle up until the wheel is a couple centimeters off of the ground. Since I forgot to take a video of me loosening the bolts, here's a picture of my car. But before we move on to the next step, we have to make sure that all of the bolts are loosened with the lug nut wrench before we take the wheel off. Now that we have almost all the bolts loosened, there's the last one. We're going to set the bolts to the side in a nice little pile. And then we can just grab the spoke right here and pull the wheel off. Now that we have the stock wheel off of the vehicle, we're going to put the spare tire on. Here's where we want to ensure that we are using that star pattern that I mentioned earlier. And we're just going to finger tighten all of the bolts just to get them started. Here's a photo of me lowering the vehicle. We want to make sure that we lower the vehicle nice and slowly so that the wheel comes down straight. Now that the vehicle's on the ground, we want to use the lug nut wrench just to make sure every nut is tightened all the way, and then we'll be good to drive with the spare tire. Once you're finished changing your tires and you're all done with the tools, you want to make sure that this kit goes back together. You put everything back where it's supposed to be and you put it in the trunk of the car because you never know when you're going to need it in an emergency.